off, we'll give an introduction of the organizations that are actually supporting this Noble course. If Egbert can take us to the next slide about the introductions about the companies, I'd really appreciate.
Coming up, there we go.
Great. Thanks. I think let's go through the outline for this webinar. Of course, we've introduced ourselves, and thank you very much for dialing in. We are going to talk about domains of culture, what we also call the layers, the cultural layers. And then next presentation will be on national cultures and the dimensions of the same. Remember, individually we have our own values and our behaviors that actually translate to our culture. And for your information, countries also have their way of behaving in terms of the people, the inhabitants of that country. So our countries of focus will be Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt. Wait on until that point in time, we're going to discuss this. And our able presenters are Egbert Schramm and Okere, who will take us through those sessions. And then later on, I'll come in to wrap up, and feel free to ask a question even as we progress. Okay, please, we can go to the next slide and talk about the companies that are sponsoring this whole event. We have Priority Activator Consulting, which is represented by myself, Eric Ngala. I am the managing partner. Priority Activator Consulting is a professional firm. We are based here in Nairobi. If you live in Nairobi, just along Chaka Road, you'll find us at Titan Plaza. Priority Activator Consulting provides integrated business advisory services, and of course, some of the key competencies we have is corporate strategy and planning. We offer end-to-end HR consulting. We also offer organizational design and development. So if that is a need in Nairobi or wherever you are, then we can be able to partner and deliver something for you. Thank you very much. At this point in time, I want to invite Egbert Schramm to take us through.
Thank you, Eric.
Egbert, the time is yours.
About Hofstede Insights, we're a global company founded approximately 34 years ago with the support of one of the biggest names in the field of comparative cultural studies, Professor Hofstede. Our niche area is that we translate his academic work into practical business solutions, whereby we help our clients to manage the impact that culture has on their work environment. At the moment, we have 130 people in about 47 countries, so we operate around the globe. Now, when we talk about culture, I think one thing to set very clear from the start is that there are many different definitions of culture, and the way we define culture is the collective programming of the mind, with which one group distinguishes itself from another group. Now, Eric mentioned earlier that there are countries, there are also organizations within countries, there are regions, and what we have basically done over the last 34 years is to put numbers to something that could sometimes be considered fluffy. And it is this data-driven approach that basically helps us as an organization to stand apart in a field filled by many different approaches to culture. Now, our head office is here in Helsinki. This is also where I'm speaking from at the moment. Blue sky, sunny, not so warm, but I think that warmth will also be brought into from our Nigerian office later in this presentation by OK. So Nigeria is one of our offices around the globe. Now, if we dive a little bit deeper in when we talk about culture, what is it that we mean? Obviously, there is a comparison between one group compared to another group. But culture exists on multiple layers. And what are these layers? If you compare culture to an onion, then on the outer layer you have what you see. It's basically the symbols, the words companies use, the logos they use, the slogans they use. Or the objects they choose to present behind them, like in the video camera you see. I have objects behind me, and of course I've selected those with a purpose. If we dive a little bit deeper, then we start talking about heroes or anti-heroes for that matter. And that basically tells us a lot about what are the behaviors and the attitudes that countries, and if we talk about organizations, that they look up to. What are the behaviors that are being celebrated, and by being celebrated or by being punished, tell us something about how should we adapt our behavior. If we dive yet one layer deeper, we start talking about rituals. How do we greet others? What is the process of meetings in our organization? If we talk about relaxation, how do people relax in different countries? If we talk about letting go of stress, what are the rituals that we have? Obviously, when you come to Finland, you will go through the ritual of going to sauna. And that says quite a lot about, for example, the Finnish national culture. Every country, every region, and for that matter, every company has different sets of symbols, heroes, and rituals. Now, what these symbols, heroes, and rituals tell us is what are the beliefs, the values of the country. And that is at the core of a country culture. What are the values that tell people or that will tell us about why do people feel strongly about the things they feel about? Now, as Hofstede Insights, we have two predominant approaches to culture as such. On the outer layers, we talk about specifically organizational culture. So what are the practices within an organization? If we talk about national culture, we talk about the feelings that people attach to the things they see. Now, if we talk about cultural change, for example, at an organizational level or at a national level, the following holds true. The deeper we go, the harder it becomes because the emotions become stronger and stronger. Now, our niche expertise as Hofstede Insights is to put data to these emotions and to make the fuzzy very, very tangible so that as a company, as a manager, you can actively do something with it. Now, today, we're going to focus specifically on national culture, so at the core of the onion, the values. Another way of reflecting on culture is by the iceberg, and I'm pretty sure that if you're interested in the field of culture, you will have seen the iceberg. Basically, the things that you can see are above level. That's basically food, dancing, language, but the things you cannot see are the things that are underneath the water. And this is where Hofstede and we as Hofstede Insights have put data to good use and help put a numerical value to a value, to basically visualize the relative difference that countries in this perspective have from one country to the next. Now, if I bring culture to the business context, then this picture tells you a lot about how is it that we leverage culture. Every manager, leader, executive has gotten, ideally, an understanding of the strategic framework in which their company operates. They will have gained knowledge and therefore a certain amount of technical competencies to do the work they do. And to all likelihood, they have been through leadership development to acquire necessary leadership competencies. Where for most leaders the difficulty starts is to understand the context in which they apply their strategic understanding, their technical competencies, and their leadership skills. And this is where we as Hofstede Insights bring an additional insight to managing an organization. It is to help managers, leaders, executives understand what is the cultural context in which your behavior impacts the values of the people around you. This is the essence. Now, let's do a little mind exercise. What do you see when you look at the picture in front of you? And given that we're not too many today, I think just use your audio to share with us. What do you see? Okay, I can see people typing. I see a frog. Yes, I can also see a frog. Who sees the horse? Yeah, it's very difficult for most people to initially see the horse. Now, do the following. Turn your head to the right. Do you see the horse now? To all likelihood, you will. The essence of understanding culture is to take a perspective that might differ from your daily perspective. If you look straight at the picture ahead, you will see the frog. But it is difficult to see the horse until you turn your head. This is basically the essence of cultural understanding, the ability to take perspective on what you see. Now, another way of making this clear is an element related to cultural understanding and empathy is embedded in the topic of trust. Now, trust is a concept whereby you yourself typically are aware of the intent you have in the words you choose, in the environment you put around you. But you're typically less aware of the impact and the behavioral interpretation that the others have on your behavior, on your communication. The others, however, in most cases are not aware of what is the intent that you have. They will interpret your behavior and they will feel the impact. Now, the essence of cultural understanding is to make very clear what is the intent of my behavior, so that with that you can enable people to put more perspective to what they see. And it is this perspective taking, this rationalization of an immediate emotional response that is critical to growing future leaders that can operate around the globe. Now, why is it difficult to know your own perspective, your own culture for that matter? One element is that if culture only exists by comparison, how do you know what to compare your own culture with? It is very difficult. If culture is about comparing one group to the next, and if it's about the tendency of group behavior, how can I recognize the tendency in my own behavior and in that of others if I'm not trained in doing so? And last but not least, when we talk about values, values are rather vague because what is more important? For example, liberty or equality on a scale of 0 to 10. How would you put the number to it? And then how would you know that if somebody else puts the same number that they also mean the same? This is basically where our approach to culture helps to give you that thorough numerical understanding. Now, sometimes people wonder, do cultures change? Yes, they do, but slowly. Because the unconscious, unchangeable values we have acquired by the time we're 12, 15 years of age. And that is not by having been taught things, it is by having observed how do our parents interact, how do our teachers interact with us. So how do we relate to certain basic social dilemmas? By the time you're 12, 15, these are embedded in your own emotional preferences. This is where national cultural differences come from the way we've been raised by our parents and other significantly important people like teachers. It's hard, very, very hard to change them. They do change over time, but because not a single country exists in a vacuum, all countries move at relatively the same speed. So this is where we can see some changes, but relatively countries remain equally different. Now, where cultural values cannot be changed, cultural practices can be changed. And this is when we start talking about cultural transformation within organizations. Practices tell us about the norms, and these norms can be changed. And in organizations, the nice thing is we can, if we must, impact how people relate to each other and to the working practices at the shop floor. Now, before going in further depth about this, I'm going to hand the word to OK, who is going to tell you a little bit more about the national cultural dimensions in our approach, based on the work initiated by Hofstede roughly 40 years ago, 50 years ago today. OK is going to talk you through today's impact of these dimensions. OK, the floor is yours. And I believe you will
Can
share your own
everybody
screen.
can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. So I have my screen up. So we're going to talk about national culture dimensions. Hofstadter, his groundbreaking research is the foundation for this. This is where this comes from. He worked alongside his son, Gert-Jan Hofstadter, and Michael Minkoff, professors, all of them. They also had research teams that worked with them. And this research has been used all over the world in both academic and professional settings. Now, Hofstadter came out initially with 4 dimensions of culture, and at the time they called it 4D. Eventually, they added another one, and then later on, around the late 90s, one more dimension was added. The 4 dimensions are power distance, and we'll talk about each of them very briefly. Power distance is the first one. The second one is individualism versus collectivism, which we will call IDV. Power distance we will refer to as PDI in terms of codes. The next one is masculinity versus femininity, which we will refer to as MAS. And then the next one is uncertainty avoidance, which we will refer to as UAI. And the last 2, which were added recently or fairly recently from the perspective of the research, are long-term orientation, which we will refer to as LTO, and indulgence versus restraint, which we will refer to as IVR. So let's talk about each of these dimensions. We'll start with power distance. Power distance, PDI, is the extent to which the less powerful members of a society or an institution accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. In other words, it's how a society or a group of people relates to power. In countries that have low power distance, it is important in such countries to be independent. When you have hierarchies, whether they're in the office context or whether they are in the government context, hierarchies are basically for convenience. They have equal rights, generally, are promoted. Superiors in every context, whether they are in government or whether they are in the private institutions, superiors are typically accessible. And when you have changes in power are typically by evolution. They happen gradually. Perhaps they might take some time. On the other context, when you have a high PDI, a high power distance country, what you tend to see is that people are dependent on those that have power. Hierarchy is existential. It's very important to have hierarchy. There are privileges, so you would probably have what will be referred to as the animal farm, George Orwell's Animal Farm, where all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Superiors are not so accessible, not accessible sometimes, and then if you're going to have change, particularly in the political context, changes will happen by revolution. So we have a graph down there, which was developed by some of our colleagues in Hofstadter Insights, that shows a picture of how power distance, how countries and regions score in power distance. The Northern European Baltic regions, including Finland, where experts sit, they score very low in power distance. Anglo-Saxon countries follow them. Japan is somewhere in the middle. Central European countries, Latin American countries, Latin Europe, that is Eastern Europe countries, and also you would have to include France as well, interestingly, in Latin Europe, Asia, Arabian countries, and you see Africa towards the high side. We will show the scores for some the African countries in our focus in terms of power distance, but we score fairly high in power distance. The next one is individualism versus collectivism, as we mentioned, which talks about how much an individual sees himself or herself as part of a group. To what extent do they depend on a group or groups in the society? So the degree of independence that the society maintains amongst its members. You can also look at it from the perspective of the we culture or the I culture, where the we culture will be countries that have low individualism. In other words, countries that are more collectivist. When we score individualism versus collectivism, we score it particularly from the measurement of individualism. So countries that score higher in individualism, they have low collectivism. And countries that score low in individualism, they have higher collectivism, if you would say so. So low individualism countries, which are countries that are collectivist, being a part of a group is important. So you tend to hear people say, we want to do this, we want to do that. The opinion of the group is important. A good advantage of or collectivist countries or countries with low individualism is that it is typically easier to form strong teams. And when you communicate in such countries or such contexts, you typically would have implicit communication. You try to avoid direct confrontation. In such countries and in such societies as well, the loss of face or shame is important. What do we mean by that? Rather than feeling guilt for something that you are personally responsible for, you tend to feel shame. You are more concerned about what the group thinks or what the group will think regarding a particular action you want to take. And as mentioned already, in low individualism countries, you tend to avoid conflict. But this is the opposite with high individualism countries. Countries that score high on individualism, the individual is important, the individual's opinions are important. It is usually difficult to form teams. Teamwork is typically difficult because, as you can imagine, you have a group of individuals. Communication is explicit. Countries tell you that straight, people tell you what they feel straight to your face. Lots of self-respect and guilt pervades over shame. So you would feel guilt over something that you have done, which perhaps nobody else knows that you have done. And then they practically welcome conflict. They're not afraid to engage in a situation that might pose a conflict to see solutions hammered out. So low IDV countries, and you can see in the graph below, China, Asian countries, African countries as well are low IDV. High IDV countries, the Anglo-Saxon countries tend to be the highest in individualism, so the US and the UK. Northern Europe as well, Latin America, not Latin Europe and the Baltic regions, they tend to be high individualistic. And then we move to masculinity versus femininity. We need to make a clarification here that we're not speaking about gender. In this case, we're talking about motivation towards performance. Masculine countries or masculine societies are those societies that emphasize performance. So they will say, do your best. Be the best. That's for high masculine countries. High masculine countries will say, be the best. They emphasize people being tough, whereas low masculinity countries will say, do your best. They are tender cultures, more socialist, if you would say so. In low masculine countries, the successful achiever is not rewarded. They want to spread the rewards amongst people in the society generally. Whereas in high masculine countries, the winner takes it all. In low masculine countries, there's a lot of leveling and consensus, unlike the high masculine countries where you have status and confrontation as what typically pervades. You have cooperation, independent cooperation in low masculine countries, but in high masculine countries, competition takes place. In low masculine countries, they have sympathy for the underdog, but in high masculine countries, people admire achievers. And in low masculine countries, so that everybody can get along and so that everybody can achieve, get to the finish line, they don't mind moving objectives and targets. But in high masculine countries, the objectives are clear, the targets are fixed, they are rigid. And this dimension is a very interesting one for Africa, because if you take a look at the graph below, you will see that the rest of Africa is generally low masculine, whereas Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, 3 of the 4 countries in focus today, are generally medium to high masculine. Nigeria and Kenya scored 60, and South Africa scored about 66 in this dimension. And then We have uncertainty avoidance, which is how a society, a culture deals with the unknown, is the extent to which the members of the culture feel threatened by ambiguous or unknown situations. In low uncertainty avoidance societies or contexts, they don't mind some level of ambiguity. They don't mind some level of uncertainty. They don't necessarily want to have all their ducks in a row before they do things. So what happens in such societies is that they trust you from the start. They don't really need a lot of structure and rules when they have events or when they have projects. This is quite different from societies that have high uncertainty avoidance. In such societies, you need to earn their trust first before they can give you trust. So you need to prove that you're an expert in what you're doing before they can trust you. And in such societies, in such contexts as well, there's a strong need for culture and for structure and for rules as well. In low uncertainty avoidance societies, they don't mind taking risks if it will assure them of success. Whereas in high uncertainty avoidance societies, they only take risks to avoid failure. In low uncertainty countries, there's lower stress and low anxiety because they allow things possibly to be laissez-faire to a large extent. Whereas in high uncertainty countries, emotions are shown openly and there is generally a higher level of stress. In low uncertainty countries, generalists are preferred. In high uncertainty countries, they prefer experts. And then lastly, in low uncertainty countries, they're typically informal. They don't mind going with a first name basis, regardless of what your status is or what your expertise is. Whereas in high uncertainty countries, you would see emphasis on your qualifications and your expertise. So a good example, perhaps, for high uncertainty would be countries like Germany and possibly the Netherlands as well, where you would see, to a large extent, people being referred to by their titles. So you would have a professor doctor, a professor engineer, rather than in the UK or in the US, where they would rather refer to you by your first name or maybe by only one title. And then when we come to the last two dimensions that were added later in Hofstede's research, the long-term orientation, it talks about how a society maintains links with its past while dealing with challenges in the future. Now, this is a very interesting dimension because there are many sides to it. It doesn't have to do with keeping to time. So just to let us know, it is your view, your perspective in terms of a time horizon. Are you short-term oriented as a society, or are you long-term oriented as a society? In a society that is short-term oriented, they are more normative. Absolute truth is preferred. Whereas in a long-term oriented society, they believe that what is true today may not be true tomorrow. So there are many truths, and that truth will depend on the time and the context. So in a long-term oriented society, they accept change easily, whereas in a short-term oriented society, they tend to focus more on stability. In a short-term oriented society, an STO society, quick results are expected. So if you don't perform in the first 2 or 3 quarters, you might be out from the company. Whereas in a long-term oriented society, they probably will be looking at your performance over 10 years or over 20 years before they make a decision. In a short-term oriented society, they spend for today. In a long-term oriented society, they save for tomorrow. And then in a short-term oriented society, when we start a business, we are shareholders typically. Whereas in a long-term oriented society, when we start a business, it's a family. It's a family business. So what do we see in terms of the spread? African countries typically are short-term oriented. And you can see the graph showing that Asian countries, Japan, China, South Korea, tend to be more long-term oriented. Then we come to the last dimension, indulgence versus restraint. And this dimension talks about how you deal with natural drives, the extent to which people in a society try to control their desires and their impulses. In other words, if something makes you happy as a society, do you indulge in it all the time, indulgence, or do you restrain? Do you refrain? Do you hold back a bit? In countries that have low IVR, low indulgence, it's all work and no play. Whereas in countries that have high indulgence, is you work hard and you play hard. Life is for the living. If you want to do something, you might as well do it very, 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 very well. Um, in low IVR countries, obligations are important, whereas in high IVR countries, leisure is important. In low IVR countries, there's a lot of pessimism about the future. In high IVR countries, there's higher optimism. In low IVR countries, they perceive themselves as being helpless in many situations. Whereas people in high IVR countries, they tend to think that they have greater control over their lives. In low IVR countries, as you will expect, because it is low indulgence, they tend to spend less. They tend to caution their spending habits. Whereas in high IVR countries, they tend to spend more, especially on things that will make them happier. So you tend to see that the people in low IVR countries, and please remember again that culture is about comparison, compared to people from high IVR countries, people in low IVR countries tend to have more introverted personalities, whereas people in high IVR countries tend to be more extroverted. And then in terms of how they relate to each other in the business context, in low IVR they tend to be more formal. In high IVR they tend to be less formal. So let's come to the scores. The four countries in focus: Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt. Where do we stand? In terms of power distance, Kenya scored 70, Nigeria scored 80, meaning that Nigeria has relatively higher power distance than the four countries in focus. So what we're saying generally is that people tend to be more egalitarian. Power tends to be more equally distributed in South Africa, generally speaking, compared to the other countries in focus. When it comes to individualism versus collectivism, South Africa scored higher. South Africa is 65, whereas the other African countries, as explained earlier, have low individualism. So you have Nigeria at 30, you have Egypt at 25, and then you have Kenya as well at 25. Meaning that Kenya and Nigeria and Egypt are more collectivist than South Africa. When it comes to masculinity, like I mentioned earlier, this is an area where these three countries, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa, differ from the rest of Africa. Most of Africa, they score with around 40, 35, 40. Egypt scored 45. But Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa scored in the 60s. And then when it comes to uncertainty avoidance, we're generally midway. Nigeria at 55, Kenya at 50, South Africa at 49, more or less 49, 50. Whereas Egypt is at 80. So Egypt has a higher uncertainty avoidance. So, sorry about that. Pop-ups. Yeah, so I'm going to hand over now to Egbert to talk about what these scores mean in the workplace. So what are the implications of these scores for these four countries when you have teams working from these four countries in the same project or in the same organization? Egbert, over to you.
Thank you. Okay. So let's reflect a little bit on African culture. Is there such a thing as an African culture? If I'm a company and I have an Africa region, can I leverage the same management methodologies across these four countries that we spoke about today? Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt. What do you think as audience? If you see the graph in front of you, do you think that you can leverage the same management techniques in each one of these four countries? So I'll just be silent for a while.
Abraham here. In my view, I think it's just not possible to have one common management philosophy all through.
Thank you, Abraham, for sharing. Is there any of the other participants who feels that the same as Abraham or feels that actually you could? Okay, as the Nordic culture saying goes, silence is basically means that you agree. And obviously, we wouldn't be here today if we weren't basically advocating that typically, if you want to leverage the natural drivers that people have, their natural cultural values, typically as an organization, you'd be smart to basically tailor and allow for local management differences to leverage local drivers, let alone the fact that each of these four countries on its own has a very sizable population. The fact that they're all African doesn't mean that they can be managed in the same way. Where can we expect the biggest differences? Now, an easy exercise that we advocate is when you plot different countries on the Hofstede dimensional scores, then you can plot them in the picture that you see in front of you. You can either do this for all 6 dimensions, or you can do this for any combination of dimensions. Now, what you see in front of you is the 4 countries that we spoke about today, plotted on these 4 dimensions. And there are a few things that stand out. Let's start with power distance. The fact that in South Africa, at large, and obviously within South Africa, but even within each of the African countries, there will, to all likelihood, be tribal differences. If we, however, look at the country at large, we can see that South Africa is definitely lower on power distance. And that means that when you talk about what makes an effective boss, it will differ. Will it be more of a paternalistic leadership style or more of a consultative leadership style that we would advocate? If we talk about getting feedback as a boss, can we trust that when we ask a subordinate directly, hey, how did you feel it's going? Can we trust that they will give us direct feedback? Or would there be different ways in which we can collect feedback? In other words, typical management approaches to collect feedback like 360 or multi-rater evaluations, can we really trust that the data we get back is reliable enough to base big decisions on? If we talk about individualism, how much value, how much dependency do we need to put on the evaluation given by individuals versus the evaluation we get by the behavioral trends we see within a group? If we talk about bringing people out in front of a group, either for punishment or ideally not for punishment but for recommendation, if we make people stand out individually, is that positive or is that negative? So some of the practices that we see coming from Anglo-Saxon management philosophies, meaning employee of the month, are we actually giving our employees a disservice by publicly recommending them, or are we actually positively reinforcing their self-image? How does that impact the group harmony? Very important reflection point. And another reflection point when we talk about structuring and planning our processes. Do we have a very clear-cut methodological approach to planning, or do we go with the flow? We adapt on the go. As we saw, Egypt specifically scoring on a much higher level with a need for predictability in daily life compared to quite a few of the other African countries that we show in front of us. So, as you can see, just by looking at these 4 countries on 3 different elements, how do we relate to hierarchy? How do we relate to the belonging within or outside a group? And how do we relate to structuring the unknown? I think we found our answer. If you want to truly ensure that you do not touch people in the core, in their values, then simplifying management approaches just by the fact that we're talking about one continent would not be a best use case. Now, that being said, I'm going to give the word back to Eric to summarize today and perhaps open the floor for some questions. Eric, please go ahead. And I'm hoping that we have Eric still on the line with us.
Eric, are you there?
I think, Eric, you're muted at the moment, so if you unmute yourself, then I think you can facilitate any questions that might come up. Yes, now you're unmuted. Please go ahead.
Whatever happened, I don't know. Thank you very much for alerting me. I could actually hear you. To all of us who logged in, I think at this point in time, we open the stage for you to ask questions to the panelists. If you have any questions, please come through. Okay, can you hear me? Sorry, okay, I can't hear you.
We can hear you, Eric.
Okay. Yeah, Eric, can you be a bit louder?
So I think what Eric was indicating, if there are any questions from the audience. Yes, now we can hear you a little bit louder.
Any questions, anyone? I can hear you, but if you can be a bit louder, it'll be fine. But it's all right.
And the rest who have logged in.
Questions, anyone?
Okay.
I have one.
Okay.
Anyone question?
Somebody has a question?
All right, thanks.
Abraham, I have a question. So, I work in a company that is basically has operations in across Africa, in 18 markets, and it's a tech company. And my question basically would be, in terms of how you would manage culture in such an institution, Egbert and okay, who would be the custodian of culture in a situation where you have a company operating in multiple markets, multiple culture settings, and all that? Where would the culture be based in, or who would actually drive the culture in such a setting?
Egbert, should I answer this, or do you want to answer it?
Please go ahead. I will add in case I would need to add.
Okay. So, yeah, it's interesting you asked that question, Abraham, because each of those companies, entities in the various countries, you have to be aware of two important factors. First of all is the national culture, and then the second one is the organizational culture. All right. What do we mean? You would have to manage, and this is a bit difficult for leaders to accept, but you would have to manage each entity differently. Why? They are in different countries, they have different contexts, and they are different people. What we do, which is one of the things that also sets us apart as an organization, is that we don't only help in the area of intercultural management, we also help in the area of organizational culture, meaning that even if we are all Nigerians, or all Kenyans, or all Egyptians, or all South Africans in a particular organization, not every Nigerian company will be the same, and not every South African company will be the same. There are peculiarities because of the people in there. And thank you, Egbert, for bringing again this slide. If you can see the slide, that just basically shows you those two important levels, national culture and organizational culture. Some organizations, they make the mistake of thinking that we can bring the culture that pervades in America, or wherever it is our global HQ is, or in Nigeria, if we're expanding to other African countries, or in Kenya, we're expanding to other African countries, or South Africa, we're expanding to every other place in the world, that we can have the same organizational culture. Organizational culture, please, I'm talking about that level now. The same organizational culture that works in Nigeria, in our company in Nigeria or South Africa, we can replicate that in other places. Well, that may not be possible. What you would see is that there will be a common thread. There will be some commonalities, but you need to be aware that for each of those entities, you probably would have to manage them differently. You have to take a different approach to them. And I speak as well from experience, talking about a company that I worked in, which had operations in South Africa and Ghana. We modeled our way. This was long before I joined Hofstadter. We modeled our way across, but when we realized that for Ghana, where we had an operation, and or South Africa, where we had operations as well, we needed to do things differently. It was just clear to us quite easily. Egbert, over to you.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, so Abraham, as okay mentioned, culture at an organizational level ideally is approached from a executive management team perspective. And one reason we would advocate for this is because of the more hierarchical relation people have to their bosses, is that the bosses, by the position they have, act as a mirror. If bosses indicate that a topic such as diversity, a topic such as localization, a topic such as respect for differences is important, then it would need to be on the executive agenda, and it would need to be reflected ideally at as high a hierarchical level as possible. As okay mentioned, an organization is able to shape the practices that it grows. And if an organization is smart, it consciously engages in understanding which practices in which parts of our business support which part of our strategy. If we know that in certain cultures people are more motivated by leisure time than by cash or financial bonuses, then if we are smart as managers, we would basically advocate the freedom for local management to decide on what is the reward policy, how do we adapt it to local cultures. If we know that in certain parts of our African business we operate in those areas of Africa where structure is more important, then we know that we can ideally fill project teams with people that have a more natural inclination to be more structured in their approach. So it is really very much an executive management decision supported by HR, not driven by, but supported by HR, driven by management, that emphasizes how, when, and where cultural programming is leveraged. I hope that answered the question on who would ideally be the custodian.
Thank you very much, Saz. That's very comprehensive.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions within the audience?
Yes, I find initiatives skewed towards individualism, like employee of the month. Does this affect growth through group or peer support? And what can be done instead?
Okay.
Did you hear my question?
Okay, would you like to pick it up?
Okay, let me take a look at that again. It says, for companies that advocate initiatives skewed towards individualism, like employees of the month, does it affect growth? I think it will depend on the context. And when we say context here, we're talking about the culture context, the country that is operating in, and the organization as well. This is a bit of not a joke, it's just a reality that I was about to explain. It is possible that you would find Nigerian, Kenyan, other Africans within their native countries where they live. It's possible to find people who, as individuals, might prefer individualism on their own, even though their country will score low on individualism. They themselves, as individuals, might prefer individualism. So what do I mean? In some companies, it can work. In some Nigerian companies, it can work. In some Kenyan companies, it can work. However, in other companies, it may not work. So we're saying that each company is different. Some of the clients we've had here in Nigeria. And we're not talking about it today, but I'll just sort of like pre-introduce it because we'll talk about it in our next webinar. For organizational culture, we have 6 dimensions as well, or 6 main dimensions, different from a national culture dimension. And one of those dimensions talks about employee orientation versus work orientation. And we see that in some organizations, people prefer to be more employee oriented, whereas in some other organizations, people prefer to be more work oriented. In some organizations, people prefer to be more process oriented, whereas in some organizations, people prefer to be more goal oriented. So it differs from organization to organization. And I would say this without trying to put a plug in for our company, that you would need professional help to help you determine what will work in your organization.
I think if I add to Okay's observation, I think the question there really is that, especially on the organizational level, culture is a support mechanism, so to say, to strategy. In other words, if you have trouble retaining people, then it might be useful to become more employee oriented. And with that, one way of doing this is that if you feel your top talent is losing, and therefore the question might beg, would it be better if we have a more individualistic reward program? The question is really, how difficult is it to find new top talent? And wouldn't it work better to create an environment whereby it's not your HR policies, but it's the team spirit that retains people? So when analyzing a cultural approach to, for example, reward and benefits, it's always a question of what is the contextual environment, and then using national cultural drivers will help you to recognize what are the group tendencies in society. So in general, in more collectivist, feminine societies, rewarding the individual is typically not a reward but a punishment, because you make people stand out, and that's not necessarily a positive thing. And I think also as a topic for our second series on culture, where we dive in more detail on organizational culture, I think we'll be able to also showcase in a little bit more depth how could you go about this. And in general, for each organization specifically, our advice is understand the strategical context in which your organization operates, and understand where and how national culture will reinforce the effect of certain management practices that you implement. I think with that being said, we'll give it back to Eric to wrap it up for today, right?
Yeah. Hello, Eric. Hello, Eric. Hello, Eric. Probably we lost Eric. I think we lost Eric. Okay, perhaps we can close on Eric's behalf, because I think we lost him. I can see a sign on his computer since we lost him. So thank you everyone for joining in.
Likewise on my side, thank you very much for spending the time with us today. We're looking forward to continuing this discussion with you locally as well. The recording will be shared with you following the webinar in the coming days. So in case you were not able to note down everything, you will be able to, at your own pace, reflect. And we're looking forward to staying in touch with you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. One last thing, if you don't mind, Brett, we promised that we were going to give away some a prize of free culture compass for those of us who have connected today. Eric will be in touch with you. Of course, we have your details already, so Eric will be in touch. And if you have any other questions or you want to know how we can help, please let us know. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day.